Hi, I'm Jamie Batts, your instructor for A&P 2. We're going to begin with Chapter 19, and I'm going to do these videos a little bit different than I did with A&P 1. Instead of making one long video, I'm going to break them up into little video segments to allow you to digest the material and hopefully make it easier to find specific points of information for you to re-listen and study. So we are starting, I'm sorry, I said Chapter 19. I said it should be Chapter 17 if you're a HCC student. And so we're going to just go right ahead, and I'm switching to screen share mode so that you can see what I have on my screen. And we're just starting with the topic of blood. This part of the lecture is going to cover the purpose of blood and a little bit of the components of blood. So overall, this kind of mini unit is all about the cardiovascular system, and we're starting with one part of the cardiovascular system, but the subsequent chapters in your book are going to cover the other parts of the cardiovascular system. So obviously our cardiovascular system contains a pump, like your heart, right? This is pushing the blood through the body, circulating it around. Then you also have these conducting tubes or vessels. We call them blood vessels. Sometimes I'll abbreviate them BV. These blood vessels carry blood to and from the heart. You have arteries carrying blood away from the heart, veins carrying blood to the heart, and the capillaries are the exchange vessels where interstitial fluids and nutrients and waste products can be exchanged between the rest of the body and the blood. And then the fluid part of our cardiovascular system, which is the blood itself. That's what this chapter is based on. This has a wide variety of materials in it. We're going to talk about those. It has a huge role in temperature regulation for our entire body, as well as aiding in defense against disease. So there's an immune component to our blood also. And there's a whole other chapter dedicated to our immune system as well. So just overall, you'll see the layout of these vessels. Obviously, the heart centrally located, mediastinum, thoracic cavity, etc. And then you have the red for the arteries and the blue for the veins. And of course, where they interchange is the capillaries. So let's talk about the functions of blood. Overall, there are three major functions of blood. One of those, the most obvious, is for transportation. It's transporting dissolved gases, nutrients, hormones, and other waste products that are a result of metabolic processes. So oxygen can be carried from the lungs to the peripheral tissues. Carbon dioxide can go from the tissues back to the lungs and be expelled through respiration. There's also a nutrient distribution that occurs. When you bring food into your body, it goes into your digestive tract, diffuses through our capillary walls in our digestive tract into the blood, and then diffuses out of our blood into the peripheral tissues wherever it needs to go. Those glucose, the proteins, the lipids, etc., all going through our body, being carried by the blood. There's also hormones. In the end of A&P 1, we talked about the role of hormones and endocrine organs and what they do. So you can imagine the pituitary releasing oxytocin or ADH or FSH or TSH or whatever, coming down and going to wherever it needs to go in the body. It's doing that through the blood. There's also waste products being carried to the kidneys for excretion. And we'll talk about how those waste products are produced later on in the semester. Another function of the blood, so number one, we had transportation. Another one is regulation. Our blood has a huge role in regulating. We mentioned temperature already, but our blood is also regulating pH as well as ion concentrations in our blood. And it does this specifically through the kidneys as well as through our respiratory tract. So it's absorbing and neutralizing any acids that are generated by any tissues that may be active, like the lactic acid that's building up in our muscles, goes into the blood and is taken to the kidneys for our kidneys to expel those extra hydrogen ions. There's also a diffusion that takes place between our blood and interstitial fluids that's going to allow for those ions to be balanced and maintain equilibrium through the tissue. So, one tissue doesn't have a higher concentration of something than another part of the body. Our blood is also responsible for restricting injury, restricting the effects of injuries throughout the body, I should say. So, in other words, it has a defense built into it, not just in terms of the immune system, but also for clotting. So enzymes and other substrates come in, form a clot. We'll talk about how that happens. And obviously, blood loss has ceased when those blood clots form. Our blood also plays a huge role in defense against toxins and pathogens, and we have a huge section of the next couple chapters dedicated to our immune system, so we're not going to get into it in this chapter. Our blood also not only stabilizes our pH, but as I mentioned before, it stabilizes our body temperature by absorbing the heat that's generated by our muscles, diffusing it throughout the body, or taking it to areas of the skin where it can then undergo evaporative cooling by the sweating technique for temperature regulation. Again, we'll talk about that more in subsequent chapters. So the blood that goes to our brain and the more internal body organs has to be maintained. So when the body temperature is low, like if you go outside on a cold winter's day, then you'll notice the first things that get cold, it's not really your head and your core, it's going to be your fingers and toes. And that's because blood flow is being restricted to those areas so that the warm blood can stay in those important core regions of your body. So overall summary functions of blood: transport, nutrients, waste products, dissolved gases, etc., regulating pH and ion as well as temperature, and restricting fluid loss, blood loss at injury sites, and defense against pathogens and toxins. You can pause the video here and go back and answer these 3 questions to see if you comprehended what the heck I was saying. I'm going to keep going, and we're going to talk about blood composition. So there's a fluid part of the blood that's called the plasma. That's the liquid matrix that's in the blood. And then there's the formed elements. The formed elements are the fancy word for cells. Those are the cells that are in the blood, or cell fragments, really. So those formed elements are the cells and cells fragments. So there's going to be a variety of, or a variation, I should say, of these substances depending if you're male, you're female, you're old, you're young, you're fit, you're not fit, etc. But on average, males tend to have 5 to 6 liters of blood, and females have a little bit less, 4 to 5. You're going to see this trend throughout our body systems as we move through this semester. Males always have a little bit more, they're a little bit bigger. Females have a little bit less, they're a little bit smaller. So then the difference is just, that's average body size is what we're going on. So whole blood is the term that's used when the entire volume has been removed. So, or the entire substrate, so the fluid and the formed elements, that's whole blood. So roughly around 38 degrees Celsius, it is much more viscous, 5 times more viscous than water, so it's very thick, and that's because of all the dissolved proteins and the water molecules balancing out in our blood. And it's also slightly alkaline. 735 to 745 is the average pH of our blood. It needs to be maintained in that level for overall health and other body functions. The whole blood can then be fractionated or separated, and this is something that is done in a lab. So when you go to the Red Cross and you donate your blood, they're taking whole blood, and then from there it can be fractionated or separated into the plasma and the formed elements. So the plasma is the liquid portion. It's a little bit more than half, about 55% of your blood is just the plasma, and then the hematocrit or packed cell volume is the other 45%. The majority of that packed cell volume, or the majority of your hematocrit, are your red blood cells. 99% is red blood cells. And again, it's on average about 45% of your blood is that hematocrit. The other 55% is the plasma, or the liquid portion. Males tend to have a little bit more, females tend to have a little bit less. And that's mostly because male hormones, the androgens, tend to beef up red blood cell production, because males tend to have more muscle, males tend to have more blood in general, so they're going to have more red blood cells. It all goes hand in hand. So here's the image from your book, breaking it all down. Here, I hope you can see my mouse. I'm not sure if you can or not. You see the whole blood. When we spin that down and separate it out, fractionate it, you have your plasma. If we just look at the plasma, the majority of our plasma is water. Over 90% of the plasma is water. This is why hydration is key. Drinking water, bring enough water into your body is super important, because that water is going to help balance out all of the other stuff that's in your blood. So what is that other stuff? It's mostly plasma proteins and other solutes like glucose and things like that. Those plasma proteins are mostly made in the liver. These are things like albumins, globulins, fibrinogen, which is a clotting protein or clotting factor. There's also enzymes and hormones that are grouped into that category because they are plasma proteins as well. Other solutes include things like sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, right? All of those ions. Other organic nutrients like glucose and other organic waste products, maybe like urea or lactic acid. So all of those substances are dissolved in the fluid portion of your blood that is mostly water. When we looked at the formed elements, the majority of your formed elements are red blood cells. You also have a small portion, less than 1%, that's white blood cells, and another less than 1% being, or less than 0.1%, I should say, for both of those, platelets. Platelets are cell fragments. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And there are different types of white blood cells that make up that part of your blood. And we'll get into those as we go through. So let's talk about plasma. It is almost identical in concentration or in composition to our interstitial fluid. It is mostly there for that fluid component, so substances can dissolve and be transported in the blood. Mostly water, as I mentioned, plasma proteins, and then other solutes. The primary difference between plasma and interstitial fluid is the levels of respiratory gases and the concentration of dissolved proteins. Oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations in the plasma and interstitial fluid are going to vary, mostly because your blood is transporting the waste products out and transporting the new oxygen in, and likewise in your tissues, they're using up the oxygen and producing carbon dioxide. So it's almost an opposite in concentrations, and it's called a partial pressure, and we'll talk about it when we cover respiration in a few chapters. The dissolved proteins are going to vary between interstitial fluid and plasma as well, and that's because the functions are different. You need different proteins in your interstitial fluid than what's in your blood. So again, we'll talk about all of that when we get to it. This is just kind of an overview of plasma. Those plasma proteins can be insoluble or soluble. They can be large and globular. They can be small. The majority of these are made in the liver. So you're going to see a huge trend this semester in our liver function. Last semester, you saw a huge trend in calcium. Calcium was like the big ion in A&P 1. We used it everywhere. This semester in A&P 2, you're going to see that liver be used over and over and over again. So this is one main function of our liver, right here, plasma proteins. All right, so let's talk about these in general. The majority of them are something called albumins. Albumins are the #1 contributor to the osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure is the pressure to move substances in or out of our blood. And so the presence of those albumins is helping our blood volume maintain homeostasis. It's helping maintain our blood pressure and blood volume throughout the body. Globulins are a smaller percentage of these plasma proteins, and these are things like our antibodies, those immunoglobulins, which are part of our immune system. They can also be transport globulins to help bind to ions and other large compounds to help get them through the blood. Those are mostly fat-soluble compounds that can't dissolve in the blood, that need like a little boat, you might say, to carry them through. So fibrinogen is the last type of plasma protein. This is a smaller percentage. It has a major role in clotting. The fibrinogen ultimately gets converted into fibrin, which are the strands of your scab. If you've ever picked a scab off and looked at it, you know you have. You'll see that it looks like little hairs. Those hairs are the fibrins. It's the basic framework for the blood clot. And there's also enzymes, active and inactive enzymes that are dissolved in the blood as well. The solutes, as I mentioned, electrolytes, I rattled off a few of these before, specifically sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, calcium, bicarbonate, phosphate, sulfate, all dissolved ions in the blood. You also have organic nutrients, things like ATP, lipids, carbs, amino acids, and then organic waste products, things like urea, uric acid, creatinine, bilirubin, and ammonia, all products that need to be excreted either in the feces or in the urine. So this is the breakdown of the plasma and its components. This is just a zoomed in view of what was on that other slide. Again, mostly water, other plasma proteins. Do you need to know what they are? Yes. Do you need to know what they do? Yes. The answer is always yes. You need to know all of it, unfortunately. Or fortunately. I don't know. I think it's kind of cool to know all this stuff. Maybe that's what makes me a super nerd. All right, other formed elements. We talked about the plasma and all the proteins. Now let's talk about the formed elements. These are the cells. So you have platelets. Platelets are a very, very small percentage, less than 0.1% of all the formed elements are these guys. And they're basically little cell fragments. We'll get it more into them later. You also have white blood cells, or WBCs. They're also called leukocytes. Leukocytes, when you break down that word, the prefix leuko, white, cyte, cell, so these are literally translating to white cells. Again, less than 0.1% of all formed elements are these leukocytes. These are our body's defense mechanisms. There's 5 classes of them, each with different functions, which we will talk about later. This is just an overview. Red blood cells, or RBCs, known as erythrocytes, red cyte cell, so erythrocytes. This is 99.9% of everything that's in your blood, or 99.9% of those formed elements in your blood. So if you've ever looked at a blood smear before, which you'll get to do that in lab if you haven't had lab yet this week, the majority of what you're going to see is red blood cells. And they almost look like these little pink discs under the microscope. And every once in a while, you'll see a purple blob, and those purple blobs are the white blood cells. Red blood cells are essential for oxygen transport. Without them, oxygen wouldn't get to where it needs to go in the body. So we're very thankful that we have them so we can function normally. So breakdown of formed elements, you have platelets, very small percentage, white blood cells, very small percentage, red blood cells are the majority. We're going to talk about these different types and how all these things form in a little bit. For right now, I'm going to stop here so you can go back and review this little section of the different parts of our blood. And in the next video, we will cover the next couple sections of this chapter. So have a great day. Bye-bye.